Magnus the Undying, Lord of the Shadowed Peaks, Scourge of the Sunlit Plains, and Emperor of the Eternal Night, was experiencing an emotion so foreign, so utterly beneath his station, that it took him a full 10 minutes of silent, throne-bound brooding to identify it. It was administrative dread. Alistair, his majordomo for the last 4 centuries, a man who had catalogued his conquests, polished his soul-trapping phylacteries, and possessed the invaluable skill of knowing precisely when to look away during a particularly gruesome sacrificial rite, had retired. The old man had cited a bad back and a desire to spend more time with his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. Magnus had been magnanimous, of course. He had only incinerated half of Alistair's pension fund in a fit of pique. Now, he awaited the replacement. The Central Authority of Unholy Resources, a bureaucratic nightmare he'd foolishly allowed to be established in the Age of Sorrows to streamline minion acquisition, had sent word. A temporary placement. A temp, the word itself was an insult, transient and flimsy. The great obsidian doors to his throne room groaned open. Magnus drew himself up to his full, imposing height, allowing the cursed shadows that wreathed his form to lengthen and sharpen. The air temperature dropped 20 degrees. A low, guttural chant began to echo from the very stones of the citadel, a sound that had been known to turn mortal men's bowels to water. He let a hint of crimson energy flicker in his eyes. It was his standard welcome to the team package. It had a 98% success rate in inducing immediate, weeping resignation. The other 2% had simply fainted. The figure that strode in did not weep. Nor did she faint. She was a woman of average height, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun that looked like it could deflect a throwing axe. She wore a charcoal grey suit that was offensively practical and carried not a grimoire of fealty or a sacrificial offering, but a leather-bound portfolio and a tablet. She stopped a precise, regulation 30 feet from the dais, a distance that felt less like respectful terror and more like an assessment of workplace safety boundaries. Magnus the Undying, she asked, her voice crisp and utterly devoid of the quavering terror he commanded. It was the voice of someone who might inquire about the quarterly earnings report or the availability of gluten-free options in the cafeteria. Magnus let the silence stretch, a tactic that usually worked wonders. He let the chanting grow louder. He let the shadows writhe. She tapped her foot. Once. A sharp, impatient sound that cut through the ancient, soul-chilling ambience like a thrown rock through a stained-glass window. "Right," she said, looking at her tablet. "Magnus. You're my 9 o'clock. Emma Collins, from Unholy Resources Temp Placement. I'm here to fill the majordomo position until a permanent candidate can be vetted." She looked up, her gaze sweeping the cavernous throne room, taking in the pillars of screaming souls and the tapestries woven from the sinews of fallen heroes. Her expression was not one of fear. It was one of mild disapproval, like a health inspector noting a code violation. "Quite the setup you have here. I'm sure the heating bills are astronomical." Magnus stared. The ancient words of power he had been preparing to utter, a litany of dread that could curdle milk in the next kingdom over, died in his throat. He felt an unfamiliar sputtering sensation in his chest. You are the replacement," he finally managed, his voice a low rumble that should have shaken the very marrow in her bones. "That's what I said," she confirmed, making a note on her tablet. "Now, Alistair left some handover notes, but frankly, they're a mess. Mostly anecdotes about a lick named Stinky Steve and what appears to be a multi-generational blood feud with the gnomes of the Glimmering Dell. Nothing about payroll, vendor management, or your current security protocols. We'll have to build this from the ground up." She took a few steps forward, her sensible heels clicking on the black marble. "First things first. Where is the central filing system? And I'll need access to all active scrolls, pacts, and infernal contracts. Are they digitized, or are we still working with parchment? Please say it's not parchment." Magnus felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. This was not happening. He was the Undying. Mortals prostrated themselves before him. They offered him their firstborn, their lands, their very souls, all for a sliver of his favor. No one, in 800 years, had ever asked him about a filing system. "I am the lord of this citadel," he boomed, the sound waves visibly distorting the air around him. "My will is the only system. Emma looked at him, a flicker of something, not fear, but professional pity in her eyes. Right. That explains the backlog. Okay, new plan. I'll start with a full operational audit. I'll need a list of all department heads, head torturer, chief necromancer, quartermaster of the damned, that sort of thing. I'll be sending out meeting invites via Ravengram until we can get a proper intranet set up. Please advise your staff that my time is billable and I expect them to come prepared with their top 3 operational pain points. She paused, looking him up and down. And we need to talk about your personal brand. The Undying is a bit much, isn't it? A little dramatic. We can workshop some alternatives. Something that projects strength but also a certain fiscal responsibility. Magnus, for the first time since the Third Age of Man, was speechless. He simply sat on his throne of bone and obsidian, the crimson light in his eyes flickering like a faulty candle, and watched as this small, terrifyingly organized woman began to assess his ancient hall of horrors as if it were an underperforming branch office in need of a serious corporate restructuring. The chanting had stopped. He suspected the spirits in the walls were as confused as he was. The first sticky note appeared 2 days later. Magnus had spent the intervening 48 hours in a state of simmering, baffled fury. Emma Collins had, as promised, begun her operational audit. She had interviewed Grolnark, his head torturer, a creature of pure malice with thrice-jointed limbs and a collection of artisanal thumbscrews. Magnus had listened in from the shadows, anticipating Grolnark's usual litany of shrieks and threats. Instead, he heard Emma ask, "So, from a workflow perspective, do you find the manual rack is creating a bottleneck? Have you considered a hydraulic system? It would improve efficiency and allow for more consistent results, which would be easier to quantify for your quarterly agony reports." Grolnark had made a gurgling sound that Magnus had, until that moment, believed was physically impossible for his species. She had then moved on to the kitchens, the armory, and the scrying chamber, leaving a trail of bewildered minions in her wake. They no longer looked at him with the familiar, comforting terror. They now wore a new expression, the dazed, hollow-eyed look of someone who has just sat through a 3-hour presentation on synergy and best practices. His entire power structure, meticulously built over 8 centuries on a foundation of pure, unadulterated fear, was being dismantled by paperwork. And then came the note. It was a cheerful, canary yellow square, stuck to the arm of his throne. The handwriting was neat, precise, and utterly infuriating. It read, "The dungeon screams are echoing into your 2 p.m. calls with the Vampire Coven. This is unprofessional and creates a challenging acoustic environment. Please either soundproof the Chamber of Lamentations or reschedule your prisoners. Thanks. E." He stared at the note. He read it again. He carefully peeled it from his throne, the delicate adhesive making a soft, insolent sound. He held the small square of paper between 2 razor-tipped gauntlets. "Thanks." She had signed it thanks. As if she were reminding him to pick up milk. A wave of pure, incandescent rage washed over him. He was Magnus the Undying. His dungeons were supposed to echo. It was a feature, not a bug. The challenging acoustic environment was part of the negotiation tactic. He crushed the note in his fist, the paper vaporizing into sulfurous ash. He would fire her. He would flay her. He would hang her soul in a bottle from his battlements and force it to listen to motivational audiobooks for all eternity. He strode from the throne room, his dark robes billowing behind him, intent on immediate and terrible retribution. He found her not in some dark corner, cowering, but in his personal blood cellar. Or what used to be his personal blood cellar. The familiar, chaotic tableau of dusty casks, mismatched goblets, and the occasional half-drained victim chained to a wall was gone. It was organized. The casks were gone, replaced by temperature-controlled refrigeration units with clear glass doors. The various vintages of blood were now stored in sterile, vacuum-sealed bags, each bearing a printed label. Emma was standing in the middle of the room with a label maker, humming softly to herself. "Ah, Magnus," she said without looking up. "Good timing. I've finished the inventory. You have a shocking amount of O-negative from the 14th century that's about to turn. I suggest we use it for a staff appreciation mixer. Morale seems low." Magnus looked at the labels. They were color-coded. Red for mortal, blue for elf, green for orc. There were sub-labels for blood type, age, and he had to squint to read it, notes on cholesterol levels. "What?" he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the stone floor. "Have you done?" "Implemented a FIFO system," she said brightly, affixing a new label to a bag. "First in, first out. It'll drastically reduce spoilage. I've also cross-referenced it with your dietary needs, which Alistair had scribbled on a napkin. By the way, you should really cut back on the high-sodium peasant stock. It's terrible for your eternal blood pressure." She gestured to a tablet mounted on the wall. "This is the new digital checkout system. Just scan your thumbprint, scan the bag, and the inventory is updated in real time. It'll also generate a weekly report on consumption patterns, so we can optimize our procurement, that is, our pillaging, cycles." He was standing in the most efficient, well-managed, and utterly soulless blood cellar he had ever seen. The romance was gone. The thrill of kicking over a random cask and drinking deep from the gushing stream of Vitae was a thing of the past. Now, he'd have to scan. "This is an outrage," he hissed. "This is the heart of my power. It is meant to be a place of dark decadence, not sterile inventory management." Emma finally looked at him, her head tilted. "Decadence is just another word for waste. Do you know what your spoilage rate was? 37%. That's just bad business, Magnus. The Vampire Coven of Carpathia runs a leaner operation than this, and they're a non-profit." The mention of the coven, his chief rivals, stung more than any holy sword ever could. He hated their smarmy, caped leader, Vlad, with a passion that had lasted 300 years. The idea that Vlad was running a more fiscally responsible empire of evil was galling. "I am firing you," Magnus declared, pointing a clawed finger at her. "Begone from my sight. I will not have my reign of terror micromanaged." Emma didn't flinch. She simply raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" "According to Section 4, subsection B of the Unholy Resources Temporary Employee Contract, which you signed in blood, by the way, termination requires a 30-day written notice and a formal performance review. Have you filled out a performance improvement plan request? Because I haven't received 1 inch. He stared at her. He had, in fact, signed the contract without reading it, assuming it was a standard soul-binding pact. He'd been in a hurry. "Furthermore," she continued, picking up her clipboard, "I've been documenting my contributions. So far, I've streamlined your blood supply, initiated the digitization of your cursed artifact collection, which, by the way, was a major insurance liability just waiting to happen, and I'm currently developing a more equitable torture rotation schedule to reduce minion burnout. Firing me now would be incredibly short-sighted." She tapped her pen on the clipboard. "This will all be in my exit interview report, of course. A report which goes directly to the head of UR. It wouldn't look good. It would suggest poor management." Magnus felt the rage drain out of him, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar feeling. It was the icy grip of bureaucratic helplessness. He was trapped. Trapped by contracts, by performance reviews, by the specter of a bad report. He, the scourge of the sunlit plains, was being held hostage by a temp with a label maker. He looked at the color-coded blood bags. He looked at the sterile, efficient room. He looked at the ruthlessly competent woman standing before him. He turned without another word and stalked back to his throne room, the echo of his footsteps seeming less menacing and more defeated. On his throne, another yellow sticky note awaited him. P.S. The shrieking from the soul pillars is a potential OSHA violation. Let's discuss noise-dampening runes at our one-on-one tomorrow. E. Magnus slumped onto his throne and, for the second time in a week, put his head in his hands. 800 years of terror, and it was all being brought down by good organizational skills. The next few weeks passed in a blur of escalating efficiency. Magnus found his entire existence being optimized. His collection of cursed artifacts, once a gloriously chaotic pile of whispering skulls, weeping daggers, and one particularly malevolent teapot, was now housed in a climate-controlled chamber. Each item was on a pedestal with a small, laminated plaque detailing its name, acquisition date, specific curse, and recommended handling procedures. The teapot now had a tag that read, "Warning, may cause existential dread and a persistent craving for Earl Grey. Do not microwave." His daily schedule, once a fluid and dramatic affair dictated by his whims, was now a shared digital calendar. Emma had input everything. 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., brooding and contemplating eternal sorrow. 10:30 a.m., conference call with the Goblin Horde, Q3 tribute shortfall. 12 p.m., lunch, ONEG, light pulp, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., general tyranny and oppression, Sector 4. He hated it. He hated the predictability. He hated the little chime his scrying pool now made when he had a meeting in 15 minutes. But he also found himself less stressed. The tribute shortfall from the Goblin Horde, an issue that would normally have required a week of roaring threats and incinerated emissaries, was resolved in a 30-minute call after Emma presented them with a PowerPoint deck illustrating the long-term economic benefits of timely tribute payments. The goblins, utterly baffled by a pie chart, had immediately agreed to all his terms. His ambitious nephew, Lysander, was a frequent, slithering presence in the court. Lysander was all style and no substance, with perfectly coiffed dark hair, robes that were more fashionable than functional, and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had always treated Magnus with a fawning, cloying deference that Magnus knew was a mask for his own naked ambition. Lysander loathed Emma on sight. "Uncle," he said one afternoon, gliding up to the throne with practiced grace. "A word, if I may, about this temp." Magnus made a non-committal grunt. He was busy reviewing a budget proposal Emma had drafted for reinforcing the western battlements. It was thorough. It was fiscally sound. It was deeply, profoundly irritating. "She has no respect for our ancient traditions," Lysander hissed, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "She speaks to the master of the kennels about the psychological well-being of the hellhounds. She tried to implement a suggestion box in the torture chamber." A suggestion box. "She is eroding the very fear upon which your glorious reign is built." "She increased hellhound productivity by 12% by adjusting their feeding schedule," Magnus muttered, more to himself than to Lysander. "Fewer maulings of their handlers." Lysander looked aghast. "But the maulings are a tradition. They're a valuable lesson in vigilance. They're a drain on minion resources and lead to costly workers' compensation claims," came Emma's voice. She appeared at Magnus's elbow, holding a tablet. She hadn't seemed to be there a moment ago. It was an unnerving habit. "Lysander, your 3 o'clock with the Shadowmancers Guild has been pushed to 4:30. They had a ritual go long." Lysander's face tightened. He hated that she managed his schedule, too. Magnus had insisted upon it, a petty little piece of revenge that gave him a sliver of satisfaction. "Thank you, Emma," he said, the name dripping with condescension. "I'm sure I don't know how we ever managed this empire before your invaluable insights into scheduling." "Neither do I," Emma said, her expression unchanging. "The previous system was chaotic and deeply inefficient. It's a miracle the whole thing didn't collapse from a lack of basic project management." Magnus watched the exchange with a strange sense of detachment. Lysander was right, of course. Emma was dismantling his legacy of fear. But she was replacing it with something else, something disturbingly effective. The Citadel ran better. His minions were more productive. His territorial disputes were resolved with less bloodshed and more binding arbitration clauses. It was all deeply wrong, and yet, it worked. His internal conflict was interrupted by the arrival of a frazzled-looking imp, who scurried up to the throne and offered a scroll sealed with the crest of the Gorgon Sisterhood. "My lord," the imp squeaked. "A missive from the Western Reach. And another from the Dragon of Mount Ashfall. And the Licklord of the Sunken Crypts is on hold in your scrying pool. He says it's urgent." Magnus felt a familiar headache begin to form behind his eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" he growled. "Why are they all contacting me at once?" Emma glanced at her tablet. "Ah, that would be my fault. I scheduled the quarterly territorial summits for today." Magnus turned his gaze to her slowly. "You scheduled them. Plural." "Yes," she said. "It seemed more efficient to get them all done in one day. The Gorgons at 1, the Dragon at 2:30, and the Licklord at 4. But the Gorgons are running late, which has a cascading effect on the entire schedule. And no one allocated time for a lunch break. It's a classic rookie planning mistake. I'll own that 1 inch. Lysander saw his opening. A sneer spread across his face. You see, Uncle? Chaos. This woman's efficiency has created a diplomatic crisis. Magnus felt the crisis bubbling in his gut. The Gorgons, the dragon, and the Licklord were 3 of his most powerful, and most volatile, vassals. Getting them all in one place, even virtually, was a recipe for disaster. Having them feel slighted by poor scheduling was tantamount to declaring war. This is your doing, he snarled at Emma, the pressure mounting. Fix it. Already on it, she said, her fingers flying across the surface of her tablet. I'm pushing the dragon's meeting back and sending him a formal apology along with a gift basket, the deluxe one, with the artisanal sacrificed goats. I'm telling the Licklord you're dealing with an internal security matter of the highest urgency, which will flatter his ego. And I'm routing the Gorgons to holding chamber 7, where the acoustics are terrible and the chairs are uncomfortable. They'll be ready to agree to anything just to leave. She looked up, her expression calm and controlled. The real problem isn't the scheduling overlap. It's the lack of a centralized communication strategy. We can discuss implementing one in our debrief tomorrow. Before Magnus could respond, the great doors to the throne room burst open. It was not a vassal or an imp. It was a phalanx of his own citadel guards, but their armor was emblazoned with a new crest, a stylized L. They moved with a purpose that was not his own. At their head was Lysander, his earlier sneer now a triumphant, predatory grin. Forgive the interruption, Uncle, he said, his voice ringing with false sincerity. But the summit will have to be cancelled. You see, there's been a change in management. More guards poured into the room, securing the exits. The few loyalists near the throne were quickly surrounded, disarmed with brutal efficiency. It was a swift, clean, and well-executed coup. Magnus rose from his throne, ancient power crackling around him. Lysander. You dare. Dare. I've been daring for a century, you old relic. Lysander spat, his decorum finally cracking. Your time is over. You've grown soft, complacent, bothering with budgets and schedules while our enemies laugh. I will restore the glory of this citadel, a glory built on blood and fear, not spreadsheet. He gestured to the guards. Seize him. Magnus prepared for battle. He drew on the dark energies of the citadel, the power of 800 years of accumulated dread. He would show this upstart whelp the true meaning of the word undying. Don't, a quiet voice said beside him. He glanced down. It was Emma. She hadn't moved. She didn't look frightened. She looked annoyed. Like the coup was an inconvenient interruption to her workday. This is not the time for process, woman, Magnus roared. This is a time for slaughter. And you'll lose, she said calmly, her eyes fixed on Lysander's forces. He's been planning this for years. He has the loyalty of the inner guard, he's timed it for when your key allies are distracted, and has probably already disabled your primary magical defenses. A frontal assault is tactically unsound. Then what do you suggest? Magnus hissed, fury and desperation warring within him. Emma held up her tablet. On the screen was a detailed schematic of the throne room. I suggest we execute Contingency Plan B7. Magnus stared. Contingency Plan. B7? Yes, she said, her thumb hovering over a large red icon on the screen. I have contingency plans for 7 different coup scenarios. B7 is hostile nepotistic takeover during high-stress diplomatic event. I flagged it as a 68% probability 3 weeks ago. You didn't read the memo. Lysander laughed, a high, ugly sound. Contingency plans? Your little temp can't save you now, Uncle. The citadel is mine. Actually, Emma said, her voice cutting through the tension, the citadel is currently in lockdown. As per Protocol B7, subsection Alpha. She tapped the screen. Instantly, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the hall as massive portcullises of enchanted iron slammed down over every entrance and exit, sealing the throne room completely. Runic symbols flared to life along the walls, pulsing with a containment energy that made the air hum. Lysander's triumphant grin faltered. "What is this?" "That's the emergency security override," Emma explained conversationally. "I had the gnomes from the Glimmering Dell install it last month. You know, the ones you have a blood feud with? Turns out they're fantastic magical engineers if you pay them on time and offer a decent dental plan. They were happy to help." She tapped the screen again. Subsection Beta, neutralize command structure. From hidden grates in the ceiling, a thick, odorless gas began to pour into the room. It wasn't poison. It was something far more insidious. "What is that?" one of Lysander's guards yelled, his voice suddenly thick with drowsiness. "A highly concentrated soporific mist, developed by the Alchemists Guild," Emma said. "Non-lethal, but very effective. Should have them all unconscious in about 90 seconds. I found the purchase order buried in last year's expense reports. It was miscategorized under janitorial supplies." Lysander's eyes widened in horror and disbelief as his elite soldiers began to sway on their feet, their weapons clattering to the floor. "No. This is impossible." "And subsection Gamma," Emma said, a hint of something that might have been satisfaction in her voice. She made one final tap on the tablet. A section of the floor directly beneath Lysander and his few remaining conscious guards suddenly glowed with a bright, intricate pattern. It wasn't a trapdoor to a dungeon. It was something far worse. It was a teleportation circle. "Where?" Lysander stammered, his legs growing weak from the gas. "To the Central Archives," Emma replied. "Specifically, to the unfiled parchments vault. The one with the faulty ventilation system and the enchanted lock that only opens from the outside once every fiscal quarter." She looked at her tablet. "The next scheduled opening is in 3 months. I'd suggest you get comfortable." With a flash of purple light and a faint scent of ozone and old paper, Lysander and his core conspirators vanished. The last of his guards slumped to the floor, snoring peacefully. Silence descended upon the throne room, broken only by the hum of the containment runes and the gentle, rhythmic snores of several dozen heavily armored traitors. Magnus stood amidst the sleeping bodies, the dark power he had summoned still swirling around him, unused. He looked at the sealed doors. He looked at the unconscious guards. He looked at the empty space where his treacherous nephew had just been. Then he looked at Emma. She was making a note on her tablet. "Note to self," she murmured. "Review and revise protocols for janitorial supplies. Potential for misuse is too high." She looked up at him, her expression as placid as ever. "Crisis averted. I'll have a cleanup crew in here within the hour. We should still be able to make your rescheduled call with the Licklord at 4:30. He'll be pleased you took his concerns so seriously." Magnus stared at her, the sheer, mind-breaking audacity of it all washing over him. He hadn't defeated the coup. He hadn't unleashed his terrible wrath. He had been saved. Saved by contingency plans, gnomish engineering, and a flagrantly miscategorized expense report. He had ruled for 800 years through chaos, drama, and fear. It had been a constant, grinding effort of intimidation and violence. It had been exhausting. And Emma Collins, with her tablet and her ruthless efficiency, had neutralized a full-blown insurrection in less than 5 minutes without spilling a drop of blood. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. Not as an infuriating nuisance, but as a force of nature more potent than any dark magic he possessed. Her competence wasn't just an annoyance. It was a weapon. A terrifying, beautiful weapon. And in the sudden, profound silence of his secured throne room, Magnus the Undying felt another new emotion, one even more shocking than administrative dread. It felt a little bit like admiration. And, to his absolute horror, a little bit like attraction. The cleanup crew, a team of goblins in hazmat suits Emma had on retainer for post-ritual biohazard remediation, was ruthlessly efficient. They hauled the snoring guards away to the deepest, most forgettable cells in the dungeon, where, according to a new memo Emma had already circulated, they would undergo a mandatory re-education and loyalty seminar. Magnus sat on his throne, the adrenaline of the failed coup slowly ebbing away, leaving a strange, hollow quiet in its place. He had faced down armies of angels, legions of paladins, and a particularly persistent band of heroic adventurers with a magical sword and an annoying sense of justice. He had never felt as thoroughly outmaneuvered as he did right now. His entire 800-year reign felt like a long, chaotic, and deeply inefficient prelude to this one afternoon. Emma stood before the dais, reviewing the post-incident report on her tablet. "Damage to the throne room is minimal," she stated. "A few scuff marks on the floor from the teleportation circle activation, but the maintenance gnomes can buff that out. No casualties among loyalist staff. The soporific gas has a 99.8% non-lethal success rate. One of the guards appears to be allergic and has developed a mild rash, but the infirmary has a salve for that. All in all, a successful crisis management execution." Magnus watched her, a maelstrom of thoughts swirling in his ancient mind. He had been ready to tear his nephew limb from limb, to paint the walls with the blood of traitors. It would have been grand. It would have been theatrical. It would have been a mess. So much paperwork. So many new hires to replace the dead. Emma's way was cleaner. Undeniably better. And that was the most infuriating part. "You knew," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual booming resonance. "You anticipated this." "I anticipate everything," she replied, not with arrogance, but with the simple finality of a mathematical proof. "It's my job." Lysander's personnel file showed a high aptitude for strategic planning combined with a dangerously inflated sense of entitlement and a noted allergy to following established protocols. He was a classic flight risk and a high-probability insurrectionist. "I started a file on him my second day here." She had a file on Lysander. Of course she did. It probably had tabs. "Why did you not inform me?" he asked, a hint of his old anger returning. "I did," she said, swiping on her tablet. "I sent you a full risk assessment report last Tuesday, subject line, urgent, potential internal security threat and succession plan vulnerabilities. You left it unread." She glanced up at him. "You leave all my memos unread." He had. He'd seen the subject line and assumed it was more bureaucratic nonsense. He'd probably been busy practicing his malevolent laughter or designing a new flag made of skulls. The mundane, tedious work of actually running an empire had always bored him. He preferred the grand gestures, the sweeping declarations of eternal doom. "I am 800 years old," he said, the words feeling heavy and old in his mouth. "I have commanded armies that blotted out the sun. I have made kings and gods tremble. And you don't read your emails," Emma finished for him. "It's a common problem among senior leadership. A refusal to delegate and an over-reliance on legacy systems. It creates operational vulnerabilities. Like this coup." There was no judgment in her voice, only analysis. She was diagnosing his reign as if it were a failing business. And she wasn't wrong. He felt a weariness that went bone deep, a fatigue that had nothing to do with his immortality. He was tired of the drama. He was tired of the constant posturing, the endless betrayals, the sheer, grinding effort of being Magnus the Undying every single day. He looked at this woman, who had brought order to his chaos, who saw his empire not as a grand tapestry of evil but as a system to be optimized. She didn't fear him. She didn't flatter him. She simply managed him. And in doing so, she had saved him from his own nephew and his own complacency. A new path unfolded in his mind, a possibility he had never considered. "This arrangement, this temporary placement, it is insufficient," he said slowly. Emma raised an eyebrow. "My contract runs for another 6 weeks. If you wish to terminate it early, you'll still have to pay out the full amount, as per the early termination clause I had legal draft for me." "I am not terminating your contract," Magnus said, leaning forward on his throne. The shadows in the room seemed to lean with him, but for once, it wasn't for dramatic effect. It was from sheer focus. "I am offering you a new one." He took a breath. The words felt strange. "I require a chief of staff. A permanent position." Emma's expression did not change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. "Calculation." "Chief of staff," she repeated. "That's a significant increase in responsibility. It would involve full strategic oversight of all Citadel operations, both domestic and foreign." "Yes," Magnus said. It would require complete executive authority over all department heads, including Grolnark and the Master of the Kennels. Granted. And it would necessitate a top-tier salary, a comprehensive benefits package including lichdom insurance and soul reconstitution options, a corner office with a view of the lava pits, and a personal cadre of impersistence. Magnus blinked. Lichdom insurance. It's a standard executive perk in the necromantic sector, she said smoothly. You have to stay competitive if you want to attract top talent. He stared at her for a long moment. She was negotiating. She was negotiating with him, Magnus the Undying, in the immediate aftermath of a failed coup she single-handedly thwarted, for a promotion. The sheer, unmitigated audacity was breathtaking. It was magnificent. A low sound rumbled in his chest. It started as a growl but morphed into something else, a rusty, unused sound. It was laughter. A short, sharp bark of genuine amusement. Very well, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It felt as unfamiliar as the laughter. All of your terms are met. The position is yours. Emma allowed herself a small, brief nod. It was the closest thing to a triumphant smile he had ever seen from her. Excellent. I'll have my lawyer imp draw up the contract. I expect to have a draft on your desk by morning. For your signature, she paused. And this time, I suggest you read it. She turned to leave, her work for the day apparently concluded. Emma, he called out. She stopped and looked back at him over her shoulder. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. Thank you felt too simple, too mortal. You have my eternal gratitude felt too much like his old, dramatic self. He settled for the only thing that felt true. The color-coding system for the blood supply, he said. It is logical. For the first time, Emma's lips curved into a genuine, if tiny, smile. I know. It's a thing of beauty, isn't it? And with that, she was gone, leaving him alone in his vast, quiet, and suddenly very well-organized throne room. The future of his reign of terror stretched before him, and for the first time in centuries, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a project. A joint venture. And he found, to his own profound astonishment, that he was looking forward to their next one-on-one. The transition from temp to chief of staff was seamless, mostly because Emma had already been doing the job for weeks. The only real change was the new title on her office door, a sleek, modern plaque that replaced the previous occupants, a warlock who had accidentally polymorphed himself into a throw pillow. Emma had repurposed the pillow for lumbar support. Their dynamic settled into a new, strange rhythm. Magnus was still the Dark Lord, the ultimate authority. But his authority was now filtered through Emma's strategic lens. His grand, sweeping pronouncements of doom were now followed by her quiet addendums about logistics and budget allocation. I will raise a legion of the undead to march upon the Sunstone Empire, Magnus would thunder from his throne. Excellent, Emma would say, looking up from her tablet. That falls under the Q4 Aggressive Expansion Initiative. I've already allocated the necromantic resources. The zombies will be ready to mobilize on Tuesday, pending the arrival of the new shipment of standardized issue FEMAs. We got a bulk discount. His enemies were utterly bewildered. They were prepared for ancient evil, for raw, chaotic power. They were not prepared for strategically planned ancient evil that arrived on schedule and under budget. A delegation from the Orcish clans of the Jagged Spine arrived one morning to dispute a border skirmish. They were a fearsome sight, all tusks, scars, and jagged axes, led by a hulking chieftain named Grak the Skullsplitter. Grak was expecting a screaming match, a challenge to single combat, perhaps the ritualistic devouring of one of his honor guard. He got Magnus, seated on his throne, radiating quiet menace. And next to him, Emma, with a projector and a laser pointer. As you can see from this topographical map, Emma said, pointing to a glowing chart projected onto the wall, your last raid, while emotionally satisfying, was tactically inefficient. You targeted a barren stretch of farmland with low strategic value. Grak grunted, confused. Now, Emma continued, clicking to the next slide, which was a color-coded chart titled Optimal Pillage Points. If you had focused your forces here, on the silver mines, you would have disrupted our supply chain by 34% and yielded a far greater return in plunder. I've taken the liberty of drafting a revised pillage schedule that maximizes your resource acquisition while minimizing your casualty rates. We can offer you this schedule in exchange for a 10% tribute on all acquired goods. It's a win-win. Grak and his chieftains stared at the chart, their brutish faces a mask of complete confusion. They had come for a fight. They were being offered a business proposal. After 20 minutes of Emma explaining the long-term benefits of a diversified raiding portfolio, they agreed to all of Magnus's terms and left with a handful of branded pens and a deep sense of existential bewilderment. Magnus watched the whole exchange with a feeling of deep, profound satisfaction. This was better than fear. This was a whole new level of psychological warfare. Their partnership extended beyond the throne room. He found himself seeking her opinion on matters he'd never discussed with anyone. One evening, he found her in the newly organized library, cataloging ancient grimoires with a barcode scanner. "The Vampire Coven has sent an invitation," he said, holding up a black envelope sealed with a wax bat. "To their annual Blood Moon Ball. It is a tedious affair. All posturing and velvet. Attendance is mandatory," Emma said without looking up from a particularly nasty-looking book bound in human skin. "They are our primary rivals in the region. Not attending would be perceived as weakness." She scanned the book. A small label printed out. Title: Fun with Entrails. Genre: Non-fiction. Dewey Decimal: 6,666 inch. She affixed it to the spine. "I detest Vlad," Magnus grumbled. "He is insufferably smug." "His operational security is a joke," Emma agreed. "But his influence is significant. We need to go, make an appearance, and engage in some light corporate espionage. I've already scheduled it in the calendar. Black tie optional, fangs mandatory." He found himself looking forward to it. The thought of attending the ball with Emma at his side, watching her dissect the coven's political structure with the cold precision of a surgeon, was infinitely more appealing than going alone. The night of the ball, he waited for her at the grand entrance of the citadel. He wore his finest robes, woven from shadow and despair, with a clasp made from a frozen teardrop of a dying star. He was, he had to admit, magnificent. Emma appeared, and for a moment, the breath caught in his throat. She wasn't wearing her usual grey suit. She wore a simple, elegant, floor-length black gown. Her hair was down, falling in a dark cascade over her shoulders. She wore no jewelry, save for a simple silver pin in her hair that looked suspiciously like a lockpick. She looked stunning. "Ready?" she asked, "all business. I have our talking points loaded onto my tablet. We focus on reinforcing our alliance with the werewolves, gathering intel on Vlad's new blood import tariffs, and avoiding his cousin, who I'm told is in multi-level marketing for a line of enchanted cosmetics." Magnus found he couldn't look away. The woman who organized his atrocities, who color-coded his curses, was, beneath the layers of ruthless efficiency, beautiful. It was a fact, as simple and undeniable as one of her spreadsheets. "You look," he began, the words feeling clumsy. "Acceptable." Emma raised an eyebrow. "High praise. Let's go. We have a schedule to keep." The ball was exactly as dreadful as Magnus remembered. The music was dismal, the conversation stilted, and Vlad was in rare form, gliding through the crowds with a condescending smirk plastered on his face. But watching it through Emma's eyes made it different. "Notice how the senior vampires all cluster near the blood fountain," she murmured to him as they stood in a shadowed alcove. "Classic hierarchical posturing. The junior members are relegated to the buffet table with the subpar vintages. It indicates a rigid, top-heavy command structure. Prone to collapse if you remove the head." "You are suggesting I assassinate Vlad?" Magnus asked, intrigued. "I'm suggesting we could orchestrate a hostile takeover by backing a more competent junior executive," she corrected. "Less messy. Better for long-term stability." Later, Vlad himself cornered them, his eyes gleaming with smug superiority. "Magnus, so good to see you've crawled out of your dusty fortress. And you've brought your accountant." "Emma Collins," she said, extending a hand, which Vlad ignored. "Chief of Staff. And you must be Vlad. I've read your portfolio. Your quarterly returns are down 18%. Shocking, for this sector." Vlad's smirk vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. We have had unforeseen expenses. I'd call it a failure to adapt to a changing market, Emma countered smoothly. Your reliance on Transylvanian peasant stock is a classic example of not diversifying your assets. The market is trending towards artisanal, free-range mortals. You're being left behind. Vlad was speechless, his face a picture of sputtering indignation. Magnus had never seen anyone render the vampire lord so utterly flummoxed. He had to physically restrain himself from grinning. He stepped forward, placing a hand possessively on the small of Emma's back. The contact sent a jolt through him, a spark of something that had nothing to do with dark magic. Emma is restructuring my entire operation, he said, his voice a low, proud rumble. We are leaner, more aggressive, more profitable. He leaned in close to Vlad, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And we have an excellent dental plan. Vlad stared at them, then at Emma's terrifyingly competent face, and for the first time in 300 years of rivalry, Magnus saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of Magnus the Undying. He was afraid of Magnus the Undying, LLC. They left the ball early, the mission a resounding success. As they walked through the Citadel's quiet halls, a comfortable silence settled between them. The partnership felt solid, real. But there was something else, too. An unspoken tension that hummed in the air. They stopped outside her office. It was a productive evening, Emma said, her voice a little softer than usual. Indeed, Magnus replied. His hand was still on her back. He had no logical reason for it to be there. He made no move to take it away. Your performance was optimal. She looked up at him, and the analytical light in her eyes was replaced by something warmer, something more vulnerable. He saw past the chief of staff, past the hyper-competent temp. He saw Emma. And he realized that his admiration for her efficiency had, at some point, morphed into a deep, abiding affection for the woman herself. The sarcastic comment he'd been about to make about her negotiating style died on his lips. This was a moment for one of those longer, more flowing sentences. My reign was a chaotic storm, he said, the words coming from a place of surprising sincerity. For 800 years, I thought that was strength. But it was just noise. You brought quiet, purpose. Emma's professional mask finally slipped. A genuine, unguarded warmth filled her expression. You're not a storm, Magnus. You're a force of nature. You just needed a little project management. He leaned down, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, to quote a regulation about inter-office relationships. She didn't. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. Their lips met. It was not a kiss of fiery passion or dark romance. It was a quiet, firm, and deeply surprising connection. It was a kiss that felt like a contract being signed, a partnership being sealed on a new, much more personal level. It was logical. It was efficient. And it was the most real thing he had felt in centuries. When they broke apart, the air was different. The unspoken had been spoken. Emma's composure returned, though her cheeks were slightly flushed. This constitutes a significant change in our professional dynamic, she said, her voice a little breathless. We'll need to schedule a meeting to discuss the new protocols. Magnus did smile then, a true, genuine smile that felt like it could crack the very foundations of his dark fortress. Put it in the calendar, he said. He turned to leave, feeling lighter than he had in centuries. As he walked away, he heard her call out. Magnus. He turned back. Your 9 o'clock brooding session tomorrow, she said, a playful glint in her eye. It's been cancelled. I've scheduled us for breakfast. He walked back to his chambers, the echo of his laughter following him down the hall. The reign of Magnus the Undying was over. The reign of Magnus and Emma had just begun. Their enemies were not prepared. They were about to face the unholy terror of strategic planning, ruthless efficiency, and a love born from mutual exasperation and a well-organized blood cellar. On the door to his private chambers, a single yellow sticky note was waiting. Remember to feed the hellhounds. And don't forget our meeting new HR guidelines for fraternization. It's a potential minefield. Also, I love you. E. He hated the sticky notes. But he carefully peeled this one off, folded it, and placed it in the pocket of his robes, right over his cold, undying, and surprisingly full heart. He read every single word.